Welcome back to my review of The Walking Dead Season 2. Things didn't actually start off too bad for the second season. It wasn't as good as the first season started, but what it did right, I think it did well enough. Unfortunately, things start to take a turn for the worse here, and it's a shame that the quality of the season starts to drop as soon as the second episode. Granted, it's still not as bad as later episodes, but it really sucks that they couldn't improve or at least maintain the quality that episode 1 had. Also, I warned about spoilers in my last video, but this is the video where that really starts to apply. You can't really get spoiled by knowing what happens in the first episode, but this episode includes the reintroduction of a character from Season 1 who's present for the rest of the season. You probably already know who it is if you've never played these games before because of all the discussion surrounding this particular character, especially after the final episode of the season. But if you don't know who it is, this is the part where you gotta tune out if you don't want spoilers, because this character is going to be present in all of these videos starting with this one. With that spoiler warning out of the way, let's get on with the review. In the last episode, Kristen and Omid were separately killed off, and Clementine was left all alone and got bit by a dog. A new group of survivors she came across refused to help her because they thought she was bit by a zombie, but she managed to patch herself up on her own, and the next morning one of the group members got bit while investigating a shooting at the river, and Clementine was left with a choice of who to run to. Okay, so the star of this episode is actually different depending on your final choice last episode, but either way, Clementine and the group member she chose to go with hide out in a small confined shelter all day until the group member decides to let Clementine make a run for it while they distract the zombies. The next morning, Clementine makes it back to the cabin and tells Carlos and Rebecca what happened. They immediately go looking for Luke and Alvin, who went out looking for Clem, Nick, and Pete, and Carlos asks Clementine to look after Sarah while they're gone. An 11-year-old looking after a 15-year-old. This is clearly a good idea, and it makes so much sense. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Anyway, Clementine goes upstairs to Sarah, who immediately takes a picture of her. She asks Clementine to take one of her, and Clem can also show Sarah how to use a gun. Not that it matters, but that's for another video. After that, Sarah sees someone at the door and goes downstairs thinking it's Luke. Clementine goes downstairs as well, and Sarah sees that it's not actually Luke. As Clementine approaches the door, the stranger lets himself in and starts asking Clementine a whole bunch of questions about herself, who she's with, if she's seen the people he's looking for. At some point, the man hears something upstairs and goes to see what it is. He finds nothing at first, but then he sees a picture of Sarah, confirming that the people he's looking for are the cabin group. After the man leaves, Clem tells Sarah that they need to find the others, but as soon as they start to leave, the cabin group arrives with Nick safe and sound. Sarah tells Carlos that a man looking for them showed up while they were gone and saw the picture of Sarah. The group then decides it's a good idea to get as far away from the cabin as possible. They decide to head out for some mountains, and then we jump 5 days ahead. Anyway, the group asks Clem to look out ahead with some binoculars she suddenly has now, and she spots a lodge in the mountains. Luke then decides to take her out on the bridge to scout ahead. How responsible of him. Luke falls through a hole in the bridge, forcing Clementine to deal with the zombies and save Luke by herself. After that, they meet a man on the bridge. The man offers some food and shelter, but Nick comes out of nowhere and shoots the man, thinking he's a threat to Luke and Clem. After the group crosses the bridge, Luke and Carlos talk about Nick while Clem looks inside the shack nearby. Yeah, that's right, just keep having Clem do all the work for you guys. Anyway, Clementine finds a knife in the shack and she uses it to open a chest containing some food. After that, a horde of zombies starts to approach and the group makes a run for it. By nightfall, they make it to the lodge. They have a look around and Luke asks Clementine, again, to look around with her binoculars to see if she sees anything. Just then, however, something's up and Clementine goes to see what's going on, and just then...
Kenny!
Clementine sees Kenny alive and well and is happy to see him. I'm sorry if I don't sound too enthusiastic about Kenny's return. It's just that... Look, I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I had Kenny's return spoiled for me before I played Season 2. I'm not sure how I would have reacted to this if that didn't happen, but I never got what the big deal is with Kenny anyway. Yeah, I liked him in Season 1, but that's really all I can say about him. I don't get why everyone else needs to have an extremely out of proportion point of view on him. After the reunion, the group is invited inside and Clementine and Kenny catch up on what they've been through since they last seen each other. Clementine spends some time in the lodge talking to people and helping out with more practical things, and Kenny's group keeps mentioning a guy named Matthew, who always seems to be still on his way back every time he's mentioned. At dinner time, Clementine has to choose who she sits with. The conversation at dinner time is different depending on who you sit with, but eventually whoever you didn't sit with joins you, and Kenny mentions that he's thinking about moving on to Wellington, the same place Kristen mentioned at the beginning of episode 1. Kenny and Nick get into a bit of an argument, but Walter calms things down and asks to talk to Clementine outside. Kenny comes out and joins them, but then they spot a woman looking inside the lodge, and it's Bonnie from the 400 Days DLC. She asks for food, saying that she has a family to feed.
My family! I have a family to feed!
Kenny doesn't trust her, but Walter decides to give her food anyway and sends her on her way. Back in the lodge, Luke tells Clementine that he found a picture of Walter and Matthew together, showing that the man Nick shot on the bridge was Matthew. Nick asks what the two are talking about, and Luke asks Clementine to hide the knife she found in the shack, but when she looks in her backpack, the knife is gone. And that can only mean one thing. Walter figures out what happened to Matt, and Clem chooses what to tell Walter when he asks what happened and if Nick is a good man. Nick then comes out, and Walter looks like he's ready to stab Nick for what happened to Matthew, but doesn't go through with it. It then starts to get really windy, causing the wind turbines to spin out of control and making them sound loud enough to draw walkers. The group goes to shut them down, and oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Are you serious right now? Clementine shuts down the wind turbine all by herself, and it's as easy as putting in a key and turning it. Jesus Christ, is there anything that this group of idiots can do on their own? Well, anyway, the group has to fend off some zombies before Carver shows up and takes the group hostage. And guess what? Bonnie's with them. That's right, Bonnie was working for Carver the whole time. Isn't that great? Clementine manages to hide and reunite with Alvin and Rebecca, and they debate on what they should do. The next part's different depending on your choice. You can either go find Kenny and Luke, or surrender to save Carlos. Carver doesn't kill Carlos anyway, but Kenny shoots one of Carver's men, causing Carver to kill Walter in retaliation. Carver then takes Alvin hostage, threatening to kill him if Kenny doesn't surrender. If Kenny tries to shoot Carver, then Kenny actually manages to hit him, but he survives and kills Alvin immediately after. Clementine can save Alvin, however, by telling Kenny not to shoot if she looks for him, or if she surrendered with Alvin and Rebecca and tries to stop Carver herself. Oh, this motherfucker's dead. So dead. Anyway, Kenny surrenders if Clementine tells Kenny to stop, or if Carver takes Clementine or Sarita hostage, and Carver proceeds to take them all back to his base of operations. Oh boy. Well, if there's anything positive I can say about this episode, it's that it starts differently depending on your last choice in the previous episode. If you saved Pete, then he and Clementine head out in a broken down truck, and Pete considers cutting his leg off to save himself, but doesn't go through with it when he realizes that he died anyway by bleeding out. Before sacrificing himself to allow Clementine to run to safety, he asks Clem to keep Nick safe. Jesus, even he's guilty of this shit. If you went with Nick, then he and Clem hold up in the shed of sorts, and we actually learn a few things about Nick. It turns out before Clem came along, the cabin group let someone with a bite stay with them, and when they became a zombie, they ended up biting Nick's mom, and Nick had to kill his own mother either before or after she became a zombie. It's the reason why he was so adamant about killing Clem in episode 1. Nick also tells us that he and Luke used to run a business together. It's stuff we can learn about when Clem is asked to go inside the shed if you saved Pete, but in that case it's optional, and you can finish the episode without ever learning this about Nick. If you do learn about it, however, I'd say Nick's arc was pretty good. You get an explanation for why he is the way he is, and the way the other characters react to it just makes it even more sad. And while we're on the subject of this, it's at this time you can give Nick Pete's watch which he left back in the cabin. But most people probably didn't take the watch to avoid having Clementine being accused of theft, and it really is theft. Makes me wonder how Nick didn't think, hey wait a minute, how did Clem get this to begin with if you do give it to him? The watch is in the same place as the bandages if you don't get them from Alvin, so it's not hard to miss, but because Clementine is essentially stealing it, most people probably wouldn't think to take it, and it ends up biting them in the ass later when they're unable to give it to Nick. I can understand Telltale wanting to make choices ambiguous, but this is a case where they make you think you shouldn't do something, and then having it turn out later on that you should have done it. This is a really minor example of something like this happening though. Believe me when I say it gets much worse later on in the season. I like the interactions between Sarah and Clem, as short-lived as they are. The Walking Dead primarily focuses on what adults go through during the zombie apocalypse, even in this game where the protagonist is a child. How Clementine interacts with other kids is something that's really interesting to me. I know Sarah's actually a teenager, but she acts on a level of maturity similar to Clementine in Season 1, so she might as well be a kid. And I think it's a shame that the two of them don't interact more, given how it makes more sense for Clementine to be friends with someone like Sarah than, say, an adult like Luke. The scene with Carver in the cabin is pretty good too. I replayed this scene many times back during the wait for episode 3, just to exhaust all the dialogue options. I gave flack back in episode 1 for giving Clementine options to act edgy, but here, however, I'm okay with it because this person is clearly an intruder who's not welcome here, so it makes perfect sense for Clementine to be rude to him. Sadly, this part of the game doesn't change anything based on your choices. More on that next video. One thing that doesn't make sense to me, and I literally just thought of this as I started to record, why didn't Sarah know who Carver was or recognize him? The rest of the cabin group is clearly familiar with him, and if they had been at his compound for such a long time, then surely she must have been familiar with him too, even if he spent more time in his office than interacting with his people. So why doesn't Sarah know who Carver is? The game never explains it. If she remembers enough to know that she can't be seen by him, then she knows enough to know who he is. Another problem with this episode is the characterization of the cabin group. In the first episode, they were willing to kill Clementine thinking she was bitten by a zombie and or working for Carver. They realize now that neither of those things were true, but now they're suddenly trusting of Clementine and relying on her to do things for them. This is a complete 180 in their attitude towards Clementine, and it comes out of nowhere. Rebecca even confides in Clementine and tells her that she thinks the baby she's having is not Alvin's, even if Clementine doesn't already know or didn't bring it up in the previous episode. But why? Nothing happens between her and Clementine for her to be so suddenly trusting of Clem. It makes even less sense for her to do this if Clementine didn't blackmail her in episode 1. It would have made more sense if the group built up a trust for Clementine over time, instead of it happening instantly. And for how much Telltale likes to tell us that our choices matter in these games, I actually don't have any choice but to hang around these assholes. I mean, you can tell these people as soon as you meet them that you don't want to be with them. You can tell Luke that you want to go find Krista. You can even tell Kenny that you want to stay with him after he offers to take you in at dinner time. But I'm stuck hanging around the cabin crew instead because my choices matter. I can't think of any reason for why Clementine would want to stay with them given how they treated her in episode 1, but now all of a sudden they want to be nice to her and it doesn't make any sense. The fact that they skip 5 days ahead after the group leaves the cabin is just bullshit. This would have been the perfect opportunity to give some character development to the cabin group, maybe even have them build up trust for Clementine like I said. At the very least, what they could have done is have Alvin go check out the bridge with Luke and give Clementine some time to talk with the rest of the cabin group before having to go to the bridge to help Alvin and Luke. It would have made more sense than just Luke taking Clementine because she's a valuable little girl. And there isn't even any good reason for why it isn't this way. It's just...
Maybe I should stay here.
No.
Fuck you, Luke. Which brings me to my next complaint, the scene on the bridge itself. I said in the previous video that episode 1 did a good job of properly characterizing Clementine because she was capable for someone her age, but still needed adults to stay alive. This is the part, however, where we start to see Clementine showing capabilities beyond that of a normal little girl. Clementine is able to take care of several zombies and save Luke all by herself with no problems. You might think this isn't so bad, but this is something that happens multiple times throughout the whole season. And would you look at that, another proper segue into the next thing I want to talk about.
Oh shit.
Another way in which Clementine's character starts to fall apart in this episode is the fact that she's given options to swear, drink alcohol, and she says shit no matter what. Just in the previous episode, she was still opposed to swearing, never doing it herself, and even telling Alvin and Rebecca to watch what they say.
Hey, language. You should watch your language if you're going to be a mom.
Yes, she can say shit in the previous episode before the time skip, but I don't really have any problem with this because it's determinate, it's a single line of dialogue, and it's a callback to season 1, where she would say shit if Lee said it in front of her in episode 1. And I don't think it was a problem back in season 1 either because, again, determinate one line of dialogue, and on top of that it was also played for laughs. Here, however, now she's suddenly okay with it, and not only are we given options to make her swear, but she swears no matter what. What happened to cause this change? Can we even call this a change? She literally goes from being opposed to swearing to doing it herself out of nowhere. It feels like they only did this to appeal to people who like Clementine because she's supposedly badass now. Before I talk about the next part, can we just look at this shot real quick? Didn't see that? Let's play it back again. This time I'll slow it down a bit. Pay attention to the characters in the shot. Wow, good job, Telltale Animating Department. That's really some AAA quality animation right there. Anyway, the next thing I want to talk about is this part.
I had a treehouse once.
Well, there you go.
I hated it.
Oh.
This might seem like a minor thing, but it doesn't really make sense to me that Clementine would hate her treehouse. I would get if she had bad memories of having to hide from zombies in it, but that's not really what they were going for here. She doesn't say she has bad memories of her treehouse, she says she hated her treehouse. And she sounds so bitter when she says it too, and yet I get the feeling that this line was supposed to be humorous. Like, Luke talks about it as if it's a good thing, but then Clementine shuts him down and mentions it in a bad way. As well as that short little pause before she says it. Still, the way the line is delivered...
I hated it.
My god. Alright, let's talk about something more interesting now. Kenny's return, like I said earlier, was already spoiled for me when I played Season 2. For all intents and purposes, Kenny coming back for this season is ultimately a good thing, but it's undeniably an ass pull. Remember when I said Kenny and Clementine catch up on what they've been through since they last seen each other? Well, a more accurate description would be, Clementine tells Kenny what happened at the end of Season 1, and Kenny tells us absolutely nothing at all.
Long story short, I got lucky. Real lucky.
I mean, you can just tell that the writers had no idea how to explain how Kenny could have possibly survived the situation he got himself into at the end of Season 1. This is another area where Season 2 could have benefited from showing us something through a flashback. Maybe it would have made for a better Season 1 DLC than 400 Days, seeing as how 400 Days was a waste of time, but that's something to be discussed in the next video. I haven't really talked about this yet, so I might as well bring it up now. This episode is also where Telltale starts to water down their formula for choice-based narrative games. The previous episode did a good job of balancing out between the three different types of gameplay modern Telltale games have nowadays, but in this episode it's mostly just picking dialogue options with a few QTEs, and hubs that don't really have anything to do with them and are more or less just an afterthought. However, I really like the hub in the ski lodge. There's actually a lot to do here, and you can choose to do the story progression tasks in any order you want. I actually consider it to be the only hub in the episode because, like I said, there's not really much of anything to do in any of the others. While we're on the subject of this, I might as well make fun of this part.
That's nice, I guess.
Yes, I can tell that this decision right here is really gonna screw me over later on. Bonnie's first appearance was a good way to toy with the player's emotions. Usually when Telltale attempts to manipulate players in Season 2, it's forced scenes of characters acting out of character for the desired effect. But with Bonnie, however, it's different. She doesn't really do anything, but if you played the 400 Days DLC, you know Bonnie, and that alone gives incentive to trust her. But at the same time, you can tell from the context that something isn't right. It's a good way to make the player feel conflicted about her before she's revealed to be working for Carver. The confrontation with Walter was really good. Good acting, good dialogue, good camera work. The focus on the knife had a great dramatic effect. The change in character Walter goes through when he realizes what happened to Matthew really makes the scene tense, and it can make you anxious about what's going to happen next. And now, we've reached the pinnacle of stupidity in this episode. Jesus Christ, when I first played Season 2, I didn't really notice its flaws, but even back then, this scene sort of gave me a "are you serious" reaction to it. I mean, they're asking an 11-year-old girl to do something that's technical and typically only handled by adults. Wasn't there anyone who worked on this game that realized how ridiculous this is? Not only that, but if Kenny's group had been staying at the lodge for such a long time, then surely one of them must have known how to turn off the wind turbine by now. If they really wanted to give the player something to do here, this was a really bad way of doing it. At the very least, they could have made this an actual puzzle like having to turn on the train in Season 1, but no, it's just click here, then click here, done. Speaking of this scene, the reason they have to turn off the wind turbines is because the noise from them spinning out of control is loud enough to draw walkers. But I did some research and according to this, that shouldn't be possible. A wind turbine is about as loud as a lawnmower when you're up close to it, but they're typically built 300 meters away from the homes they're supplying energy to. And at 400 meters away, they're only about as loud as a refrigerator. You mean to tell me that refrigerators are loud enough to draw walkers? I find that hard to believe. The final choice in this episode doesn't change how the next episode begins, but it does change how the scene plays out, or rather, how we see it. If you choose to go look for Kenny and Luke, then Luke's nowhere to be seen, but we see how things play out from Kenny's perspective, and we have direct influence on Kenny's actions here. He shoots Johnny no matter what, leading to Walter's death, but you can directly intervene to stop him from shooting Carver so Alvin can live. If you decide to surrender to Carver instead, however, then we see events play out from inside the lodge, and the only way to stop Kenny from shooting Carver when he takes Alvin hostage is to bum rush Carver, or call for Kenny to stop shooting. This causes Carver to take Clementine hostage instead, and my god do I want to see this motherfucker dead for what he does to Clementine. It's also the only way we find out about a man named George, someone Alvin apparently killed that Carver was good friends with. This is never really elaborated on, however, but I'll save that for the next video. Lastly, the final choice with Kenny ignores an obvious third option for no reason. Just because I don't want him to shoot Carver doesn't mean I want to turn myself in. Luke certainly took a third option, so I don't understand why we couldn't as well. I understand that all the characters needed to get caught, but I feel like it could have been handled better. Maybe Kenny could have agreed to stop shooting and wait for the right moment to strike, but then Carver pulls out Sarita and threatens to kill her if he doesn't surrender. Something like that. It shows that Telltale doesn't really think about every solution or way that a situation can play out when writing these games. Well, that was episode 2, and what can I say? Telltale already started simplifying their formula by reducing the amount of time episodes last from 2 hours to 90 minutes, and now they're watering them down further by removing interactivity from them. On top of that, Clementine is now starting to become the super capable mega child who's doing way more than she should for someone her age, and the adults are becoming way too reliant on her. And like I said at the end of my last video, it only gets worse from here. And we're going to see just how much worse it gets when I look at episode 3, In Harm's Way. Thank you for watching, see you in the next video.